Well, the year was 1914. Turn that down a little bit. The year was 1914. It was a couple of months into World War I, and it was a Christmas Eve. The British soldiers were on one side of no man's land, and across the wasteland, the German soldiers were there. And on Christmas Eve, the British could hear the Germans singing, and they recognized the song. Even though it was in German, it was Silent Night. And so the British soldiers decided to sing Silent Night back to them in English. And then another Christmas carol came from the other side, and back and forth went these songs, these hymns all night, until the morning came, and then cautiously some of the soldiers emerged. And so some of them emerged from the trenches, and they came over to greet one another. They shook hands. They exchanged little gifts, chocolates and buttons and little trinkets that they could, anything that they could exchange. And some of them, there were reports that even decided to play a game of soccer or football. And if you can believe that, some of the soldiers wrote home saying it was surreal in this time of great war and just darkness, where they could hear these songs of peace and just to see what happened. Of course, you can imagine that the military commanders, they were shocked when they heard what happened, and they forbid any more interactions between one another. And that was the last that had happened during the war. But yet, true story that did happen. For a moment, the power of the light and love of Christ pierced that darkness of sin and death in that moment in history. There's another war where this was alluded to, what God's power and God's light was going to bring years later. Before this war, 2,600 years before this war, there was another war that broke out. And this is going back to the Old Testament. And now, it's hard for you to read this, but I can zoom in here in a minute. This is during the time of the divided Israel, where you had the north and the south, and you had a king over the north and a king over the south, where God's people were divided. And the kings in the south were always connected to the lineage of David. And so on the left here, you'll see this little lineage here of David and all these different kings that existed. If it's green, they were a good king. If it's red, they were a bad king. And gray, they were kind of just in the middle. And sometimes they went from bad to good, and you can see that happening. And on the left, there was no good kings. One maybe a little bit, Jehu at the beginning of his reign, but that's about it. And this is the kings of the north. So this story happens, and it's actually told in 3 places in your Bible. It's told in Chronicles and in Kings, and it's also told in the book of Isaiah. And this is the story of Ahaz. No, can we back out of that? Okay, perfect. This is the story of Ahaz, which is down here. You'll see Ahaz was an evil king. There wasn't too many in the south that were as bad as Ahaz. He was very evil. This is the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was one of the greatest kings in the south. And this story happens about 10 to 12 years before the north was taken into captivity by Assyria. So let me tell you about this war. Here is Ahaz in the south. I'll go back to that in a second. So here's Judah, the south, in blue. Israel in pink. And this is at a time when Israel actually attacked Judah, their own people, fighting each other. And Israel was coming down. They had conspired with the king of Aram, and the two were coming down and attacking Judah from the north. But what's also interesting is that Judah found themselves also being attacked by Edom and by the Philistines down in the south and in the west. On every side, darkness is coming in, and they're finding themselves in such a bad position. So many deaths, so many casualties. And this all happened because King Ahaz was a wicked king. He did some terrible things. King Ahaz even He worshiped other gods. He closed down the temple. He stopped worshiping God. He even sacrificed his own child to another god. But God gave Ahaz a chance. And so again, here we go. I zoomed in a little bit here so you can see this is where it's happening with Ahaz. Isaiah the prophet goes out to meet him by the watering hole. And he goes out to meet Ahaz to give Ahaz a chance. To say, Ahaz, you don't have to worry. God is with us. God is our strength. And don't worry about what these armies are about to do. With God on your side, you do not have to fear them. And then he said, just ask for a sign. Anything. You know, when we look at the story of Gideon, and Gideon's like, Lord, are you really going to be with me? Can I test you? You know, with this fleece, in the morning, if the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, then I'll know. And then, you know, one more day, if the fleece is dry and the ground's wet. And so he tests the Lord. He says, now I know, God, that you're really with me. And during that battle, God even said, Gideon, if you're still afraid, go down and listen at the camp. Listen to what they're saying. And Gideon was still afraid. So here is Ahaz, and God says to tell Ahaz, he says to Isaiah, tell Ahaz to ask me. Ask me for a sign. It could be anything. Ask me something crazy, and I'll show him. I'll do it. And Ahaz says no. If you can believe it. God comes to Ahaz. Instead of Ahaz saying, God, please, how do I know this is real? God says, you can ask me. And Ahaz says no. He says, I don't want to test God. But actually what Ahaz was doing, Ahaz had a different plan. You see, all these people were coming in from different directions. And God allowed it because of all these wicked things that Ahaz did. And so, because of all this, he just explained in 2 Chronicles 28 that Ahaz, he shut down the temple, sacrificed his own kids. He did all kinds of terrible things. And because of this, the Lord allowed the north to come and defeat him. Because of what he did. In a single day, 120,000 of Judah's troops were killed. Good people were taken away. Women and children taken into captivity. All these terrible things happened because the king, leading the people, failed to rely on God, even though God said, I am with you. The armies of Edom and the Philistines had raided the towns. And so instead of saying, God, I know you are with us, he said, I'm going to get another army to help, the Assyrians. The Assyrians were the ones that eventually destroyed them. So the dark blue is what Assyria had owned at the time. Dark green, sorry. And the light green area is how far they expanded, 10 to 20 years later. I mean, the Assyrians were a superpower. And so what does Ahaz do? Ahaz, instead of relying on God, he goes to the king of Assyria. But instead of helping, the king of Assyria attacked Ahaz instead of helping him. Actually, he first attacked him to cripple him. But then he helped him. Because Ahaz, he even went into God's temple before he shut it down. And he took all the gold and silver and he tried to buy the help from the king of Assyria. And so the king of Assyria comes. The king of Assyria cripples him. And then the king of Assyria helps him. So the king of Assyria was his savior that day. But before all this, God had sent Isaiah. God had sent Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 7. The Lord said to Isaiah, go and meet him. He said, you will find him at the end of the aqueduct that feeds the water. Tell him he doesn't need to fear the fierce anger of those two burned out embers, the king of Aram and the king of the north of Israel. But unless your faith is firm, I cannot make you stand firm. In other words, you need to decide. And then he said, ask the Lord for a sign of confirmation. Make it as difficult as you want, as high as heaven or as deep as the place of the dead, and I'll give it to you. And Ahaz says, no, I will not test the Lord like that. And God said, well, Isaiah said, you must not exhaust the patience of my God as well. Must you exhaust the patience of God as well? All right, then the Lord himself will give you the sign. Look, the virgin will conceive a child, and she will give birth to a son, and he will call him Immanuel, which means God with us. With us is God. Even though you don't want God's sign, even though you have given up on God, God made a promise to his people. God has not given up on humanity. Even though you are living through a dark time, and guess what, Ahaz? God is not going to rescue you. As a matter of fact, you will find dark times, but don't think that God has abandoned his people. And so later on in Isaiah, that time of darkness and despair will not go on forever. The land of Zebulun and Naphtali will be humbled, and there will be a time in the future when Galilee of the Gentiles, which is along the road, runs between Jordan and the sea, will be filled with glory. The people will walk in darkness, yet will see a great light. For those who live in the land of deep darkness, the light will shine. For a child is born to us, a son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His government and its peace will never end. He will rule with fairness and justice the throne of his ancestor David for all eternity. Even though humanity continually fails, God does not fail us. And you know, even though he has decided to not rely on God, we got to see what happens when people do rely on God. For it's Ahaz's son, Hezekiah. If you remember, Hezekiah had the same Assyrian army come and threaten them. And Hezekiah relied on God, and in a single night, one of God's angels went out and destroyed hundreds of thousands of troops of the enemies. One angel. But that's not the biggest war that people had to worry about. There was a cosmic war. There was death and eternal damnation that was directed at us because of our darkness, because of our sin. Because, like Ahaz, we rejected God. Going right back to the story in the garden. But God loved us so much, he would not abandon us. For a child would be born. A child who would conquer and become king. A child who would restore. A child who would renew. And a child who would bring peace and hope for eternity. And that's the message that we remember at this time of year. And whatever your beliefs are on the date, whatever your beliefs are on how to get this message across, the fact is the incarnation of Christ, Jesus coming into this world, was a huge event. The Apostle Paul talks about it. Christ becoming one of us. He humbled himself and became obedient to death. This was a message that Matthew, looking back to Isaiah, looking back to Chronicles and Kings, this is a message that Matthew begins his gospel, one of the 12, when he tells us about the dream that Joseph had, where the virgin will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they will name him Immanuel, which is God with us. And this is a story that Luke highlights. When an angel came to tell the world, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all people. This is something that God is fulfilling his promise, that God is fulfilling his faithfulness. He has not left us in the dark. He has not left us and abandoned us to death and to eternal damnation, but yet he was willing to put everything on the line. God entered into time and space. How does God, who lives outside of time and space, enter into time and space? How does a God who cannot be tempted become so vulnerable and allow himself to be tempted? God put everything on the line for his people for his children, you and I, made in his image, children of the King. This is truly good news. Good news that we read as Jesus reminds us, for God so loved the world that he was willing to give his one and only Son. And this is judgment. The light has come into the world. The people love darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and avoids it. But anyone who lives by the truth comes to the light. A great light has come to this world at just the right time. When the Romans had created peace for the road system, Greeks had common language. It was just the right time for God to enter into time and space. The Jews were under the Romans, and yet Jesus came to a humble household. And he was willing to give his life to make everything right so that we can have eternity with him. And that's the story that people are open to hearing at this time of year. That's the story that we're told to spread, to share. This is the story of the good news, the gospel. The story that we're told to go and spread, and the story that people are wanting to hear about. What does this mean? And one of the best ways we can do this is taking the things that we do at this time of year and talking about it. When we give gifts, we remember the greatest gift God gave to us. And some people decided to tell this story using other things. And I mentioned this at an event a couple weekends ago. The story that some people share when they have a tree in their home. Some of you may see a tree and you may say, what does this have to do with the story? The tree was used at a time when people couldn't read or write. There was a lot of people that weren't able to read or write, and there was no television, but people learned by seeing. And so they would put on these plays to tell the story. And so these were called the Paradise Play, where they would take a tree and they'd put it in a courtyard or something, and it was cold in Europe, and you couldn't just take a dead tree and tell the story of the Garden of Eden and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and what people did and how they sinned and how darkness, and the world was broken and darkness ruled. And so they would take an evergreen, because, it looks like a tree. It's not just a bunch of dead-looking branches, and they would hang apples from this tree. And so they would hang apples from the tree, and then they would act it out. And so you had a tree with some apples, and you had a couple playing Adam and Eve, and one would grab the apple and take a bite, even though it wasn't an apple. It was forbidden fruit. We don't know what it was. Perhaps it was an apple, and God just let us keep eating them. But I don't think it was an apple. It was a forbidden fruit. And humanity took of that fruit when God said, don't do it, don't do it. And the chapter ends. Christmas Eve is when this Paradise Play happened. And the chapter ended with darkness and brokenness, leaving the garden and a broken relationship with God and sadness. But then Christmas morning came, and lights were put on this tree, and a star, because the star was associated with Jesus coming, with God becoming one of us to fix us. God becoming one of us to restore what was broken. And so the star, of course, that led the Magi some years earlier to later on to this house where Jesus was staying. And these trees were eventually, people loved the story, and these trees were eventually brought into homes. And those apples were replaced by little decorations where they hung on their trees. And the trees were decorated with light and a star on the top. And so the tree stood in the middle of winter, hope after the fall, light in the darkness. And there's the story, the good news, that God didn't leave us abandoned. That God knew that he would need to come and give it all for us. And so, whatever way you tell the story, don't just tell it at this time of year. I mean, people are open to it. Tell the story this time of year, but tell the story all year round. And we tell the story when we meet every Sunday. We tell the story through being a light in the dark world. But God has called us as his people to tell this story, to invite others in, to show the hope that God has for all people. Because all are his children, and all have walked away, but all have the hope of coming back and having restoration with him. And so, Immanuel, God with us. Jesus came into the world, but Jesus never left. Even though physically Jesus left with his new body, and he will come back one day, but he did not leave the world without him. He said, unless I go, the Spirit will not come. He gave us his Spirit that lives in all of us individually, and he gave the world us, the church. And so now, as Jesus' hands and feet, God is still with the world through us, and God is still working to show the world his love. May God bless us as we continue to share this story. May God continue to show the world through us his great love. And may we do the best we can to plant and water as God does the growing, and we see the light conquer the darkness. Let's stand for our final hymn.